We think we know the Mongols, the lightning cavalry charges, the feigned retreats that lured enemies into annihilation, the psychological terror campaigns that made cities surrender without a fight. These tactics appear in every history book and every documentary about Genghis Khan and his successors. But one strategy does not. It was arguably their most devastating weapon, and yet you will search in vain for detailed accounts in mainstream historical sources. This was not an accident. Generations of chroniclers and historians made a deliberate choice to look away. Today, we are finally going to look directly at what they hid. To understand what was erased, we first need to understand what the Mongols wanted us to remember. The historian David Morgan has noted that Mongol military success rested on three pillars: superior mobility, sophisticated intelligence networks, and ruthless psychological warfare. These elements appear prominently in both contemporary chronicles and later official histories. The Mongols themselves promoted these narratives. They wanted enemies to know about the speed of their horses and the accuracy of their composite bows. Fear was a weapon, and controlled information was its ammunition. But the sources also contain gaps, curious silences where details should be. The Persian historian Juvayni, writing under Mongol patronage in the 1250s, occasionally mentions that prisoners were put to use during sieges, but rarely elaborates. Chinese sources from the Jin and Song dynasties reference similar practices with equal vagueness. For centuries, historians accepted these gaps as simply reflecting the chaos of the period. The historian Timothy May, an expert on Mongol military tactics, argues that this interpretation is far too charitable. The gaps were not accidents. They were policy. The erased strategy was called the Hushar. The term itself is Persian, meaning crowd or levy, and it sounds almost administrative. It was anything but. The Hushar system transformed captured civilians into expendable military assets on an industrial scale. When Mongol armies approached a fortified city, they would first sweep the surrounding countryside. Every person they captured became Hushar: farmers, merchants, entire village populations. These prisoners were not enslaved for labor in the traditional sense. They were weaponized. Here is how it worked in practice. Before an assault, Mongol commanders would organize the Hushar into units and force them to march ahead of the actual army. The prisoners filled moats with earth, stones, and, when necessary, their own bodies. They carried scaling ladders to the walls while Mongol archers provided covering fire, not to protect the Hushar, but to suppress defenders long enough for the prisoners to reach the fortifications. Those who refused to advance were killed immediately. Those who tried to flee toward Mongol lines met the same fate. The only direction permitted was forward, into the arrows and boiling liquids of the defenders. The scale was staggering. At the siege of Nishapur in 1221, contemporary sources suggest the Mongol army employed Hushar, numbering in the tens of thousands. The Persian chronicler Juvayni, despite his general reticence on the topic, records that the assault waves continued for days. The defenders of Nishapur faced an impossible arithmetic. Every arrow spent on the Hushar was an arrow not available for the Mongol warriors behind them. Every stone dropped on the human waves was a stone that could not be dropped later. The Hushar exhausted the city's defenses through sheer attrition of human life. But the psychological dimension was equally calculated. The Hushar often included people from the very city being besieged. Defenders on the walls would recognize neighbors, relatives, former trading partners, stumbling toward them under Mongol whips. The choice presented was unbearable. Kill your own people, or watch them breach your walls. Contemporary accounts describe defenders who simply stopped fighting, overwhelmed not by force, but by horror. The Mongols understood that breaking human bonds was as effective as breaking stone walls. The siege of Urgench in 1221 demonstrates the system at its most systematic. The historian John Masson Smith has calculated that the Mongol forces employed captured prisoners to divert rivers, demolish outer fortifications, and conduct repeated human wave assaults over a period of months. Urgench was one of the largest cities in Central Asia, and its defenses were formidable. The Hashar made those defenses irrelevant. Smith estimates that casualties from the siege, on all sides, exceeded hundreds of thousands. The city that had taken centuries to build was dismantled in months, much of the labor performed by prisoners who knew they would not survive to see its fall. Given how effective the Hashar system was, why do we hear so little about it today? The answer lies not in the fog of history, but in deliberate editorial choices made across centuries. The erasure began almost immediately after the Mongol conquests ended. When Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in China, his court historians faced a problem. The Great Khan wanted legitimacy. He wanted to be seen as a proper Chinese emperor, a civilized ruler in the Confucian tradition. The Hashar did not fit this narrative. Court chronicles began emphasizing Mongol military genius and administrative innovation, while quietly omitting the mechanics of how cities actually fell. The pattern repeated elsewhere. The historian Peter Jackson, an expert on Mongol-Islamic relations, has documented how the Ilkhanate rulers in Persia sponsored revised histories that downplayed the brutality of the initial conquests. Juvaini himself worked under Ilkhanate patronage, which explains his curious reticence on certain topics. He knew what details his employers preferred to forget. The Secret History of the Mongols, the closest thing to an official Mongol account, mentions prisoner use in sieges only obliquely. The emphasis falls on heroic cavalry charges and strategic brilliance. The Hashar becomes a footnote, then a rumor, then nothing at all. European historians compounded the problem. Victorian scholars approached Central Asian history with their own biases. They were fascinated by the Mongols as a military phenomenon, but uncomfortable with tactics that seemed to lack honor or martial virtue. The historian George Lane has noted that 19th century accounts consistently emphasize set-piece battles and siege engineering while glossing over mass civilian coercion. The Hashar did not fit romantic notions of medieval warfare. It was easier to ignore than to explain. Even modern popular histories perpetuate the silence. Documentaries about Genghis Khan focus on the composite bow, the relay messenger system, the decimal organization of the army. These are safe topics. They can be discussed without confronting uncomfortable questions about what happened to the people who stood in the way. The Hashar remains in specialist academic literature, discussed in footnotes and journal articles that never reach general audiences. The strategy that may have killed more people than any other medieval military innovation has become a scholarly secret. What does this tell us about how history works? The historian Morris Rasabi has argued that every historical narrative is a negotiation between what happened and what people want to remember. The Mongols themselves began this negotiation while the empire still stood. They wanted to be remembered as conquerors, not as orchestrators of mass death. Their successors wanted legitimacy. Later historians wanted coherent narratives that fit their own cultural expectations. Each generation of editors made choices, and each choice pushed the Hashar further into shadow. We should be careful, however, about treating the Mongols as uniquely cruel. The Hashar was not invented by Genghis Khan. Similar tactics appear in ancient Assyrian records and in Chinese military treatises predating the Mongol conquests by centuries. The Mongols simply deployed the strategy with unprecedented scale and efficiency, as they did with everything else. Judging 13th century warfare by 21st century standards offers easy moral satisfaction, but limited historical understanding. The more honest question is why we remain so eager to forget. This is what makes the erasure meaningful. History is not simply what happened. It is what survived the editorial process, what fit the narratives that powerful people wanted to tell. The Hashar was effective precisely because it was horrifying. That same horror made it inconvenient for later rulers seeking legitimacy and later historians seeking clean stories. What we remember about the Mongols tells us as much about ourselves as about them. If you want to explore more uncomfortable truths about medieval warfare and how popular culture gets history wrong, We have covered several related topics on this channel. These videos take considerable research to produce, so please consider supporting our work on Patreon. Your support helps us continue examining the parts of history that others prefer to leave buried.